Hello, and welcome so much to Thallo's webinar on the Corporate Buyer's Guide to Carbon Credit Quality. I got to make sure not to say that too fast. I am so honored to be your host for this event. My name is Contessa, and I am thrilled to be here with all of you today. At Thallo, we understand that the world of carbon credits can be complex and confusing, especially for corporate buyers who are just starting to explore this field. That's why we've brought in a panel of experts who will provide a comprehensive overview of carbon credits, including how to determine quality and what to look for. So get ready to learn, ask questions using the Q&A function, and gain valuable insights into the world of carbon credits for corporate buyers. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's get started. So I want to start off this session by, of course, having all of the participants introduce themselves. And why you are introducing yourself, I would like for you to answer the following question. Give us your 2-minute high-level summary of what a high-quality carbon credit is. And I'm going to pick on Henning first because you're right next to me.
All right. Thank you, Contessa. Yes, exciting to be here. So I'm an associate partner with Bain & Company. We're a global strategy consulting firm. I'm based in Amsterdam, lead our carbon markets work in Europe, work here with clients up and down the value chains, that is on the supply side, but also on the demand side, working with corporate buyers. And similarly, Bain has always had a very strong position working with investors. So that is kind of a third lens of our work in carbon markets. Before joining Bain around 5 years ago, I was a project developer. So I've been in carbon markets for now probably 15 years. I've joined back in 2007 or 8 in the early days of the Clean Development Mechanism. And ran and developed a few startups based in Beijing for a couple of years, and then based in Hamburg in Germany for another 3 before moving to Bain. My perspective on what constitutes a high quality carbon credit, I mean, it's a very difficult question. And of course, for any buyer that moves into this market and tries to understand what is behind that term quality, this is a daunting world that emerges. I think from my perspective, the very key thing that a high quality carbon credit needs to create or needs to achieve is it needs to deliver on the promise that it makes. A carbon credit always represents an underlying action that can be an avoidance or a removal action, meaning you either avoid emissions versus a baseline scenario, or you remove carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it in a more or less durable way. But either way, that credit needs to create transparency of every action along the way, because only then a buyer can really judge what they are buying and get transparency on the claim that they can make. And then, of course, you can layer up different characteristics and criteria that drive the perspective on quality on the buyer side, which are the additionality, the baselines, the leakage, the durability of the storage. All of these dimensions, and I'm sure we'll dive into a lot of those in the coming conversation, drive different perspectives on what constitutes quality, but quality always lies in the eye of the beholder. So buyers also need to make a decision what type of credit, what quality level kind of fit into their strategy and their claim that they want to make.
Thank you so much. Charlotte?
Hello, everybody. I'm Charlotte. I'm co-founder and director of Climate Focus, which is a consultancy and think tanks advising governments and NGOs and the private sector on international engagement in climate investments, climate policies, climate measures, quality. So first, I say the first priority is of a high quality carbon credit is that it comes from an investment or project that has positive environmental and social impacts on the ground. There is no and cannot be any good high quality carbon credit that doesn't have measurable local benefits. So the second priority is that the project generates real and measurable emission reductions or removals. And that's where it becomes complicated, because an emission reduction or a removal is always measured against a counterfactual. It is always measured against something that would have happened otherwise, which brings us into a mind-twisting, future foreseeing game, which bears risks. We can get it right or we cannot get it right. And there is some investments are very clearly additional and where it's easier to set a baseline, and there are others where it's more difficult. Now, to which extent Bayer wants to take a risk of a project maybe associated with higher risks of not being additional also depends on the use of the carbon credit. And that's an important perspective that we need to take, because if a buyer wants to use a carbon credit as an offset to compensate emissions, it needs to be low risk when it comes to additionality and real and measurable emission reductions. If a company buys a carbon credit, for example, in the context of beyond value chain mitigation, and looks more towards the positive local impact and more social benefits, the buyer may be inclined to take more risks on the additionality of the carbon credits. So it's, I think, to summarize it, local benefits, then real and measurable emission reductions. And number three, this in the light of three, which is the use of the carbon credits.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Great. So Catherine Duff, principal with BCG, but the other intro is working with the World Economic Forum, so being a fellow on the Sea Climate Leader Alliance, and in that role, working with also the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance. So I'm going to have a much more natural climate solutions focused, and know that my other panelists can speak to the engineered removals and to the technical solutions, but big flag, that's not the area. We've been focused on bringing together various NGOs, Indigenous people and local communities, corporates, and then some of the governance committees together to look at, as Charlotte, I think, accurately described, it's very complex. There's different people coming in from different perspectives, so trying to bring that all together. So when I think about high quality, I mean, number one, as Charlotte said, is especially within the natural climate solutions, biodiversity and Indigenous peoples and local communities. There's two levels to it. One, do no harm. Just at the baseline, right? You can think about examples of it's a reforestation project, but it's actually taking away arable land from local communities that are now being increasingly impoverished, and then you're just moving that deforestation somewhere else. Or it's an invasive species that you're planting that's going to have a lot of damage to the ecosystem. Beyond that, you want to have, as Charlotte said, positive impacts. But beyond the do no harm, it's going to oftentimes be a complex trade-off where you're balancing on different risks and different benefits. And then obviously addressing permanence, additionality, leakage, double counting, robust quantification and verification of the actual climate mitigation activity implemented. But I think Charlotte said it really well. And the one thing that I'll add that I think is really critical as you're approaching, there's high quality carbon credits, but there's also high quality buyers, right? When you think about, you need to be thinking and to make that trade-off that Charlotte mentioned, where does this fit within your overarching climate strategy, right? What is your credible pathway to net zero? And how are you using this as part of the solution, not a replacement for the solution? Once you have where it sits in your portfolio, I think Charlotte said it really well, especially in natural climate solutions, there's different trade-offs, right? An avoidance credit might have amazing social benefits, might have phenomenal biodiversity benefits, but there's a greater risk. around the carbon mitigation side. And depending on how you're using it and your sophistication of your company, you might not be willing to take that risk. Is it high quality or not? That's not there's many high quality projects, but it's, as I think Charlotte said really well, understanding how it's being used, what then is your risk appetite, and where are you on that knowledge journey that Henning was alluding to, of how informed can you be to make that call?
Great point. And that kind of leads to the next question that I have is, what advice do you give to corporates that want to buy carbon credits but don't know where to start? What types of questions do they need to ask themselves? And that's for anyone on the panel to answer.
I'll maybe start with what I said earlier, and then would love, Charlotte and Henning, what your thoughts on. I think the first thing is you should have an overarching climate strategy, especially if we think even about reputational risk, right? If you're just going and purchasing carbon credits and you have no credible path to mitigate your emissions, I don't think any advice that we give you beyond that is actually going to be helpful when it comes to greenwashing claims, when it comes to being credible, when it comes to engaging on that. So the first thing I would say is look holistically at your company. Think about a credible science-based path to net zero, to interim targets, and then when you look at maybe where your unabated emissions will be year after year, what you'll need in terms of net removals when you get to net zero, and then work back from there and say, how can a portfolio of carbon credit solutions fit these goals of what I'm trying to do? And what are my broader, and I would say, especially when it comes to natural climate solutions, and Charlotte, maybe you have thoughts on this, how do I actually think about being nature positive as well? Because I think there's also a lens of, what do I want my footprint to be on nature more broadly? How do I think about my biodiversity impacts? Have a broader conversation about that, I think, is step one. Then we can talk about how do you get intros to the carbon markets, but I wanted to start with that's number one.
And maybe I can take it from there, because once a company has that broader climate strategy and engagement strategy and a strategy that credibly embeds the use of carbon credits in this context of supply chain and operative emission reductions of the company, then I think it needs to look at the project types it wants, or methodologies it wants to prioritize. And here again, one has to think, and going back to what we said in response of the first question, looking again in which context the company wants to use this carbon credits, whether it is beyond value chain or within the value chain, and what kind of claim it wants to associate it with this. And we may discuss that a bit more further along in this webinar, but that's important. I think then, in particular, large corporate buyers should conduct project-specific due diligence and engage in the long term. It's a bit, if we have a very small buyer that is an SME organization, will always rely on intermediaries, and that's fine. But larger companies should know the projects, and I also think they should engage on the long term. What we talk about, if we look at, and in particular, we look at this also in the context then of the Paris Agreement and Article 6, we look about cooperative approaches. So it is about a cooperation in the longer term. And that gives the entities, the communities, whoever the company is dealing with on the ground, a comfort that there is a partner that they can count on. And I think that's important. That's also important for the company, of course, to make sure that whatever safeguards it formulates, that they are also complied with. Then I also think project due diligence, engage in the long term, and involve the government. I think the government in the host country may or may not have regulations that apply to the voluntary carbon market, but it should always be informed. We see now that many governments feel deeply insecure because they don't know, they don't understand the voluntary carbon market, and they often don't know what is going on in their country. And that's not helpful, because for them it is a way to meet their national climate strategies. So it is good that they are informed and maybe not formally approved, but are generally supportive of the project or the investment, and also confirm, and I'm not saying about any kind of approval requirement, but that the project is aligned with national priorities and laws. Then if this, we heard a lot of criticism with respect to particular methodologies, whether it's avoided deforestation, or now we have it with criticism around cook stoves. Does that mean that buyers have to ban these investments altogether? I don't think so, because there are investments that are good, but definitely, again, look at what happens on the ground and embrace reform. So if you invest into these type of activities, anticipate that the carbon standards are currently revising the methodologies, and make sure that the investment also works if there are less credits, and that also means paying a fair price. I think the times are history where it's all about getting bulk of cheap credits. Henning?
Yeah, I mean, difficult to add something new to these super comprehensive answers, so I won't even try. But maybe one last point to add, and I fully agree with everything that Catherine and Charlotte said. But one point to add is that it sometimes feels to me, especially in the last 2 years, 3 years maybe, where we see this massive recent growth in carbon markets, that a lot of the approaches that people take risk repeating some of the mistakes that we made in the early days of carbon markets in 2005, 6, 7, or 8. And so building on Charlotte's last point, that any participant in the market should embrace that constant evolving of the market and the constant learning that everybody in the market needs to do. There's no final level of expertise that you can get to and then you start acting. My recommendation to anybody that wants to embrace the market and buy carbon credits is to also look at some of the experiences that big corporates, but also smaller companies went through in the last 15 years, learn from those mistakes that were made in the early days, and try not to repeat them, but rather push the market forward to a new level of quality, a new level of integrity. Because that is where the market eventually needs to go if we want to scale it from the 100, 200 big corporates that currently use carbon credits as a meaningful tool in their climate change strategies to the next 500 and the next 1,000 to scale the impact at the market.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I would add that I think we've alluded to, and maybe Henning, you can even add to this because you're closer on the technological solutions than I am, is you should take a portfolio approach. It's going to be, I'm sure throughout we'll do the annoying thing of, and as Charlotte said, it's not that you ban this. It's not that there isn't a necessary, it's a mix, right? We know that technological solutions are going to be needed in the long term, but they're very expensive. Get exposure to technological solutions, invest in bringing down the cost, but also there's a lot of natural climate solutions that are needed. If we don't have those in the long term, we're also in trouble. It's the benefit of what we need as a society as a portfolio approach to these. But secondly, as a corporate, as Charlotte and Henning were talking about, there are risks, right? That's true. There are changes, and having a diverse portfolio in terms of the types of solutions, underlying those solutions, the different methodologies for those solutions, and also, as Charlotte was talking about with governments, different jurisdictions as well are what we're seeing a lot of companies thinking about in terms of risk mitigation, but also in terms of great exposure and learning, right? We know the technological solutions are going to scale. Great to understand that now. We know that different governments are dealing with Article 6 in a different way, and working with a government that's maybe more advanced, that helps you with working with governments that are less. I don't know, Henning, if you want to add anything on I know the technological solutions and the forward-looking balance in the portfolio is also important.
Yeah, no, fully agree. And I think especially on this technological removal side, I tend to think about these type of credits or the portfolios that companies are sometimes building, essentially similar to a portfolio that maybe a VC investor is building with different companies they're betting on. Because there's so many technologies out there, that is enhanced weathering and all these ocean technologies. And then we have direct air capture and BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Some of these technologies will not turn out to be successful. They might have unintended consequences that scientists find out once we scale them up. There might be technologies that eventually don't have the potential to be scaled to that gigaton scale that we need each and every one to get there, to really think of them as a success 30 years from now. And so if you look at these investments as a portfolio of bets into different technologies, some will work out, some won't. It feels to be a much healthier view rather than, putting your money, your investments into one technology, one project type, one company potentially, because there the risk then becomes very, very unmanageable.
Excellent. So I want to pivot just a little bit because I have some questions about definitions. We heard a lot of interest about carbon removals as compared to carbon avoidance credits. What's the difference? And what's your recommendation about what types the corporate should buy? And that again is for anyone.
Happy to make a start and jump in. Well, I think this directly ties into what Catherine just brought up, this portfolio approach. I think I'm personally a big fan of the Oxford principles for net zero aligned carbon offsetting that defines or creates a view on a portfolio of carbon credits between now and 2050 that starts now essentially with these avoidance credits, nature-based avoidance credits, which typically are forest conservation. It's a project that we could scale up quite quickly into the scale that we need them to be, because eventually carbon markets at the moment are the only tool that we have developed on a global scale that is capable of providing the massive amounts of capital that we need to preserve natural ecosystems. But then as you move towards 2050, what we eventually need to do is to kind of transfer those projects, those nature-based solutions, into likely more government-funded solutions, jurisdictional approaches, and eventually ramp up at the same time nature-based removal. So that is reforestation, peatland restoration, these types of activities that use natural processes to take carbon from the atmosphere and sequester it, while we're at the same time ramping up the engineered removals through something like a VC approach, as I just described, to eventually transition to the permanent storage, because that is eventually where we need to go to. We're taking carbon out of very permanent storage reservoirs in oil and gas fields or in coal mines. And if we don't eventually put carbon back into permanent storage solutions, it's not a sustainable approach. So if you think about transitioning your portfolio of credits, even in those big categories, that's likely an approach that gets us to net zero much more sufficient or much more effectively as focusing on one type or the other. Because that is often what I see. It's this kind of infight in the market between avoidance or removal. We need both, unfortunately.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add? Charlotte?
Yeah, well, I can come in. First of all, I don't think that we should, everything is needed, okay? Emission reductions are needed, long-term avoidance is needed, and sequestration in biomass is needed, and sequestration in using technological solutions are needed. So I'm not a fan if these solutions are pitched against each other. One thing is, of course, looking at the use again of these carbon credits, and for the long-term neutralization, one has to use carbon removals. However, it is a mistake now, from a climate point of view, it's a mistake now only to invest into removals. If we do not reduce emissions now, we will not solve the climate crisis. However, we can sequester how much we want. We need to bring the emissions down. So don't feel bad if you invest in emission reductions. It is absolutely needed. Now, we also need sequestration, and we need it in biomass, and we need it in using technological solution. Here again, I'm not a fan of saying only technological solutions are durable and biomass is not. First of all, remember that the Amazon is 500 million years old. We do not have a technological solution where we have any kind of similar evidence where people have used it to sequester carbon. It is, of course, there is the risk of removal. However, it is from the microclimate, from the overall climatic and the biodiversity and water functions. Investing into biological removals is investing into life. And weatherization will never be an investment into life in the same way. Life, and I mean people and animals and plants, everything. Having said this, these more expensive technological solutions are necessary. We need them. There needs to be investment. But again, just to reiterate what Catherine also said, look at it from a portfolio point of view. And also, it also doesn't mean that every company has to do everything at once, right? But think where you and your company fits into this continuum of activities that are needed, and invest then in the long term in the particular solutions. It will be more than one, but the solutions that you think are most adequate for your company and your portfolio. And it's also one important point, of course, particular companies have existing relations in countries, have supply chains which bring them already into the land sector or technological sector or whatever it is. And then it makes, of course, sense that these companies find investment opportunities in the areas where they already hold expertise.
Yeah. And I think to just add on to what Charlotte said at the very beginning is also think about how it fits into your broader strategy. We're seeing a lot with natural climate solutions, so technological solutions, very important, that it's fitting into a broader strategy on being nature positive. We're seeing the trends when we think about COP15 that just happened and some of the discussions that happened at COP26, that's becoming increasingly important. So the EU passing deforestation regulations on products. I mean, that's a future wave that's going to be coming down the line. And as Charlotte said, investing into life is probably a good skill set for companies to build through the carbon markets that will likely be applicable as they start extending this to their own operations. And I think that goes really well with Charlotte's set of where you have a footprint, understand what's available, understand Indigenous people, local communities, biodiversity around you, because probably you're going to have to start thinking about that beyond the carbon market soon, is what I think is going to happen.
So to kind of continue the conversation, what risks should corporates be concerned about in buying nature-based carbon credits, and how could they mitigate this? And this is for you, Catherine.
That's a great question. We've put together with the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance a guide on this, but I think number one is coming back to what Charlotte said, which is large companies need to start doing project level due diligences. I'll talk about that a little bit. For companies that don't have, I'll just do a quick note on companies that, as Charlotte said, it's not feasible that they're going to do project level due diligence. It's important to do a due diligence on your provider. And there it's critical for natural climate solutions. I'll say the number one thing, and then we'll talk about the carbon mitigation that's really important, but I really want to make sure we don't forget about people and biodiversity. Ask them questions. Do you have a policy on ensuring that anything that you buy, the majority of the proceeds go to Indigenous people and local communities? If the person you're working with says, no, we don't have any policy on that, red flag. It's a big issue that the actual benefits aren't going to the local people and Indigenous communities. And same on biodiversity. What are your policies on biodiversity? How do you think about baselines? If your service provider who's going to help you get these credits, especially if you're a smaller company, does not have an answer at all to these questions, that's a really big red flag. And so that's just number one. Then when we think about the project level due diligence, I won't go into too much detail, but we can share the resource afterwards. We suggest a list of questions to start the conversation, because one thing to note with natural climate solutions, the same way Henning was talking about, there's all of these different technological solutions. Peatland conservation has different baseline methodologies, has different biodiversity impacts, and might be in a geography with completely different Indigenous people and local communities. So the biome itself is important to consider. Charlotte and Henning have been alluding towards these baselines and these methodologies. Secondly, there's a couple different ongoing processes, right? The ICVCM, there's VCMI that are re-looking at a bunch of these methodologies. So being aware of these ongoing processes related to methodologies have a big impact. And then to give the quick answer, but again, we have these lists of questions that I'm not going to read through because some of them are biome specific. The other thing is making sure it's a verified climate mitigation impact. There's a couple ones that are all well respected, like Gold Standard, these verification ones that look at it. Do your own due diligence on these, be aware of the ICVCM and the different processes that are ongoing, but make sure that a credible verification, third-party verification process has taken place on the climate mitigation impacts that are linked to it, and then ask additional questions on the people and biodiversity impacts, because when we did a baseline of all of the standards, there's no standard I can tell you that I'll say, yep, this covers properly the social and nature side. So you have to ask it yourself.
Thank you so much for that. Charlotte, I have a question for you. And I think you mentioned this earlier in one of your statements. Recently, the EU has issued guidance on green claims that can be made. How does this guidance impact carbon credit purchases?
Thank you. Yeah, at the moment, it does not yet, because it is a proposal for a green claims directive. So this proposal has been tabled by the European Commission. It needs to go through the legislative process, which involves the Council and the EU Parliament. And if and when adopted, but it will undergo changes in this process for sure. But when it then is adopted, the member states of the European Union have a certain period to transpose the directives and its requirements into national law, and then again a few months later it enters into force. So, but it is already relevant. It is already relevant because it clearly shows corporates where the regulatory environment is moving to. And considering that, you know, the engagement of the corporates is also over a longer time horizon, it is absolutely relevant to take this into consideration. And this, the Clean Claims Directive also picks up and reflects and reacts to increasing court activity. So we see more court actions and broad corporates that need to defend certain claims in national courts, which is something that corporates need to be already concerned about now. So if and when adopted, this 2002 proposal for a green claims directive will expand existing legislation on misleading and unfair practices and be a lot more specific than what we have at the moment. It will look at environmental claims, and that includes labels and explicit verbal claims, that it is not unsubstantiated, so it's robust, and that where it relates, among others, to any future environmental performance, that it is supported by clear and objective and verifiable commitments and evidence. So this is important because it is putting the claims into the context of the corporate commitments. And that's relevant here for our space, the carbon credits. It then says that the member states have to enact legislation that ensures that anybody who makes or trades environmental claim will substantiate these environmental claims, and that means they need to be able, whoever trades in these claims need to be able, among others, that these claims are based on scientific evidence and scientifically robust, that there is no harm associated, also that a climate claim doesn't lead to biodiversity harm or vice versa. But specifically with respect to carbon offset, it also says that additional information needs to be given on how the corporates use offsets. They need to specify the offsets plus be specific on how they use it. And this substantiation, so this justification and explanation of the environmental claims and labeling schemes has to be independently verified. And member states have to come up with a verification procedure that makes sure that a third party verifies these claims. So this puts significant. So groups think it may not go far enough. So because some groups have said we should essentially ban climate neutral claims altogether. This is not what this proposal does, but it defines very substantive requirements that make sure that the claims are more transparent and they are verified. And again, every corporate then has to always be able to produce this information that led to this claim. Yeah, in a nutshell. It's a complicated, it's an 80-page document. It's really not so easy, but that's the very short, condensated summary.
I appreciate you trying to take that large document and summarize it so that we all have a better understanding. Henning, there was a question that you answered in the Q&A, and I just want to make sure that we address this on the webinar. One of the questions was, what were some of the big mistakes that were made in your view? And I was wondering if you'd like to answer that out loud for everyone.
Happy to. So there were, I mean, as Charlotte mentioned, the market constantly evolves, and it needs to, because it is a very, very complex system that we're setting up. And very naturally, there were mistakes being made. And so there was a question around what are some of the examples in those early days? And you know, just a few to mention, but I'm sure Charlotte and Catherine can add a few others on top of that. Probably to highlight a bit is the early experience with HFC projects that were made under the CDM. It was a project type that addressed industrial gases that were emitted in the production of coolant, so refrigerator coolant materials that have a massive global warming potential. They're nearly 24,000 times as potential as carbon dioxide. And what happened, what the market likely underestimated in the early days, was that there was evidence that showed that the revenue that was generated by carbon credits from destroying these gases was exceeding the revenue that the facilities that produced them as a byproduct were generating just from their general economic activity. And so there was evidence that showed that some of these facilities were increasing their production output to the maximum that was allowed to generate carbon credits. And so essentially these factories turned from coolant factories to carbon credit factories, which was a very unintended consequence, of course, of carbon market. Other examples were, and Charlotte mentioned some of them, the learnings that the market collectively made on the claim side. So under what scenarios, under what conditions does it make sense to claim carbon neutrality, net zero, nature positive, all of these different claims that corporates can make and should make under the right conditions, but they all come with very complex kind of messages behind them. And we've seen in the past confusion arise on the side of the consumer, because it's just very, very difficult to understand what actually stands behind these claims. And so taking these learnings and making sure that is consistently applied on the path going forward, in my perspective, is absolutely crucial for every participant in the market, especially in a field that is as new as maybe some of these new Web3 developments, where a lot of innovation is happening. And that's a fantastic thing for carbon markets. And I think it has a huge potential to make carbon markets better. But it's important to also not discard the learnings that call them legacy markets, or the traditional carbon markets have made along the way.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I would add, and Henning and Charlotte would like your thoughts on this too, is mistakes that companies have made where they set a budget. They set I want to abate X million, X however many tons of carbon. And then they set one price, what they think the market price is, maybe $4 per ton. And they give their procurement officer, get me these many tons of CO2 for this total amount of money. And And that is a mistake. You need to, look at as we mentioned, a portfolio approach. Different methodologies will have different prices, and you need to give your procurement team flexibility to make calls on that. In my view, and when we've talked to a bunch of different companies, is it's more important in the short term as you're building up capacity to focus on high quality versus necessarily meeting your tons of CO2 goal, and understand that prices will change and have that flexibility. So I think companies ran into a lot of trouble where they gave their team that didn't have that much experience a very clear directive, and then you're going to chase after the lowest cost options, and sure enough, that's created some problems.
Thank you
I
so
fully
much.
agree. Yeah.
We are quickly running out of time. There is just so much information. We've answered some questions from the Q&A. I have made a copy of all of them, and I will make sure that we answer these offline. But I want to ask one more question to our panelists, and then I'll bring Nick up for a very brief presentation that he has. It seems like guidance is always changing. What is one or two resources corporate should pay attention to for the most up-to-date information?
Happy to take a first step, but I mean, first of all, it's probably an illusion to think that you can follow one source for all the up-to-date information, just because there's so much development going on. I think a couple of fantastic ones to follow certainly are the SBTi, Science-Based Targets Initiative, the ICVCM, the VCMI. That's some of the major initiatives that are happening in the market that drive some of these conversations. Beyond that, I mean, I personally find some of the conversation that is going on LinkedIn fantastic. So there are a number of great opinion leaders on LinkedIn that people can follow to stay up to date on some of the latest conversations. And then, of course, there are the kind of news aggregators in the market. Certainly, some of them come with expensive subscriptions, but for people that are in the market and build a career in the market, I think it's an investment well spent to follow just on a daily newsletter basis the recent headlines.
Thank you, Catherine. I saw you smile when I asked the question.
Yeah, I think the wanting to have one specific ones. The ones I'll add is there's CORSIA and ECROA are frameworks that are regulatory frameworks, and they have carbon crediting programs that they've endorsed. So Verra, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, and the ART and Plan Vivo. Looking at, as Charlotte mentioned, actually the methodologies are changing in the thinking, and looking at what those carbon crediting program standards are putting out and how they're changing their methodologies is a good thing to keep track of. And then in terms of quality, there's some, as Henning mentioned, that are more of the paid subscription, like a Silvera, or some of them are partially free, like the Carbon Credit Quality Initiative. There's some good tools out there, but that should be matched a bit to the portfolio mix that you're looking to. As different one of these only score subsets of the market. There isn't one holistic tool that will score every possible project that you would want to look at. So understanding where you have the most exposure and then making an investment in some of those good ones that hit the subset of credits you're looking at.
I agree. I also cannot offer this one solution. In particular, if you look at the claims and everything, this is yet another topic. We have published last year and update currently something which is called the VCM Primer, which is really for starters. Anything that Catherine and Henning have mentioned now here comes on top, whether you look at the ICVCM or the SBTi, lots of good publication. If you just want some read on a Saturday afternoon to understand what it's all about, then type in VCM Voluntary Carbon Market Primer, and you have something which you can browse and to get an idea for the starters.
Thank you so much. I will definitely be Googling that after this so I can get a better understanding. Now I want to call Nicholas up to the stage for his presentation on our supply side offering. And Nicholas, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, so Nicholas Alexander. I play the role of head of partnerships here at Thallo. Much of that means engaging both with the supply side of the market and the demand side of the market. And I've prepared a very quick presentation to quickly demonstrate what we do at Thallo and how we hope to help people on their kind of procurement journey. I did absolutely love a lot of the kind of different discussions and different points made by both Henning, Catherine, and Charlotte. And I hope to kind of reflect that in some of the slides you'll find today. Just a brief kind of overview. What is Thallo? Essentially, we are a climate solution company that aggregates supply across the carbon market and provides that directly to demand-side customers. We do this in two ways. We have the Thallo Exchange, which is essentially an ecosystem which allows buyers, sellers, and also traders to interact, buy, sell, trade, and retire carbon credits from accredited registries. We also have something called Carbon as a Service. Essentially, this is the same access to the supply side, those project developers that you see on the left, but accessing that supply directly via APIs. The APIs allow you to build in carbon credits directly into your goods and services so as to enhance your kind of sustainability offerings. We work with across a number of different registries, and we see ourselves an enabler and a tech provider. There are three pillars that underpin what we do, but to capture them all, I would say that we are a project developer first platform. What does that mean? Essentially, that means that when we were first created, we were wondering, okay, we're an exchange, we interact across the supply and demand spectrum, but whose interest do we really want to help solve and promote? And for us, the answer was really much on the project developer side. And so our project developer focus manifests itself by making the market easy, equitable, and efficient. And we do this in a number of ways, but I won't go over into this because I really want to jump into reflect the conversation that we had today about carbon portfolio management. So on this slide, you'll see a sample portfolio, much simplified as to what a carbon portfolio could look like. And reflecting some of the comments that the panelists made, additionality, permanence, geographic variety, and co-benefits is all of fundamental importance. There was also a conversation about the difference between carbon removal, which is typically more expensive. So here the indicators are up to $100 to $300 a ton with regards to avoidance. And avoidance can also be kind of further disaggregated into tech-based avoidance and nature-based solutions. And so just generally speaking, by providing access to the whole of market, we essentially enable people to, with ease and with confidence that they're accessing the supply side directly, build these carbon portfolios. And just by ways of example, we have listed a few of our supply side partners there. On the carbon removal, this is a very interesting project done by Carbon Cure. Essentially, I mean, this is really at the cutting edge. What they're doing is they're sucking carbon from the atmosphere and they're injecting that directly into cement. What that does is that makes the cement not only stronger, but it permanently sequesters the carbon into the cement, making it very kind of verifiable, quantifiable, and permanent, which I think was some of the points made by the panelists. Charlotte earlier mentioned the benefit of kind of local benefits. And so we've listed Burn Technologies as an example of a cook stoves provider that really emphasize socioeconomic benefits across their projects. And so just for those who don't know, cook stove projects are avoiding the kind of open wood fires, so providing cook stoves, clean and efficient cook stoves, to families and beneficiaries across primarily sub-Saharan Africa for a burn. And that displacement towards a cleaner energy provision actually has a lot of social and health benefits. And indeed, kind of that has a gender lens as well. Finally, you can tell that Catherine is very keen on nature-based solutions, and she's absolutely right. So the third kind of category there is a project by Greenox they have these immense, what are called REDD+ projects, which is essentially avoided deforestation across the Amazon, which these are fundamental to the carbon market because it's about preserving the most biologically rich portions of our planet. They are sequestering carbon, they're providing a rich ecosystem of life that we risk, be it kind of modern capitalist systems, actually deforesting at an alarming rate. So, I mean, once again, to recap, this is just an example of a not very sophisticated carbon portfolio, but shows how you can kind of manage risk and diversify across geographies, whilst actually investing in some of these kind of really catalytic and more expensive carbon removal technologies, whilst having a very strong nature and biodiversity kind of lens. One thing that we didn't discuss on this panel was the difference between kind of spot purchases, which is essentially purchasing from the open market today, and kind of forward purchases. So essentially paying project developers for the price of credits in the future, because projects tend to have multi-year cycles, but the project developers need that upfront capital. And so here, I won't go into all of them, but we've listed some of the huge variety of different types of carbon credit generating projects that have a range of benefits and that require capital now to scale up in the future. And actually, there's a lot of benefit to investing in these forward purchases because you can actually secure better prices and mitigate price increases over time for your company. So I'll leave you with that. If you're more interested to finding out what types of inventory or supply side offerings we have at Thallo, there are some emails there. And you can also sign up to offers and weekly updates at thallo.io, sorry. Yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There is a slight little error. I did put the correct L in the chat. So it's thallo.io/supply. That would be the correct URL. And I will make sure that everyone who's watching the replay will get that as well. We are at the end. I feel like I could continue this conversation for at least another hour, but I understand that our wonderful panelists have things to do today. So maybe we'll do a part 2 to this one day. Special thank you for Charlotte and Henning and Catherine for their insights. Before we wrap up, any last words, any closing thoughts? What is one thing that you wish everyone would know as they walk away from this webinar today?
It's complicated, but worth engaging. And at the end, it is manageable. Don't feel that scared away.
Thank you.
Learning together is important for the market, learning in the open, sharing best practices, and walk this journey together.
Yeah, transparency. As a company, be transparent about how you're using them, be transparent about what you're doing. We just need more transparency overall in the whole space. So as Henning said, learning in the open. As Charlotte said, it's worth it. So let's just be open and honest.
That is such a beautiful way to end today's webinar. I hope that you found this webinar informative and that it cleared up any questions you may have about purchasing carbon credits. I know that it was helpful for me as someone just beginning on this journey. If you have any further questions or would like to know more about Thallo and our work in this space, please don't hesitate to reach out to the sales team. You can also reach out to me. My doors are always, always open. Thank you so much for joining us today and have an amazing rest of your day. Take care now and bye.
And thank you, Contessa, for an amazing hosting. Very well done.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care now.
Thank you.
Bye.